All right. Chapter 4 Chronicles of the Early Britons. What does that say? I'm not sure what YF. If God will, at an other apter time and in more apt place, marvelous agreement of the histories of antiquity and great unlooked for light and credit will be restored to the originals of Brutus. I don't know what half of those words were, but I got it. Cotton, Miss Vitellius. All right. John D., 1577. On Wednesday, 7th November 1917, Flinders Petrie, a renowned archaeologist of the day, addressed the assembled members of the British Academy. He was to present a paper to the entitled Neglected British History, in which he drew attention to the fact that a considerable body of historical documentary source material was being overlooked, if not willfully ignored by modern historians. He drew fleeting attention to the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and then homed in on one particular record that shed much light upon Geoffrey's too disparaged history. The ancient book to which he drew attention was known to him as the Tysilio Chronicle, which is listed today as Jesus College, MSLXI, and lodged in the Bodleian Library, Oxford. It is written in medieval Welsh and is, as its colophon reveals, a translation that was commissioned by the same Walter of Oxford who commissioned Geoffrey of Monmouth to translate a certain very ancient British book into Latin. It is, in fact, a translation from early British into medieval Welsh of the same source material used by Geoffrey, and is an answer to all those learned critics who have Excuse me. I'll find my cadence. I promise. It's early in the book. Just let me work it out, people. Who have stated with such emphasis over the years that Geoffrey of Monmouth was lying when he claimed to have translated such a book. However, this is not the only light that Welsh Chronicle was to shed, for it was to address matters of far greater import and relevance than the mere vindication of Geoffrey's good name. Indeed, it contains historically verifiable accounts that overturn many modernist assumptions and teachings about our past. More importantly, the material that it contains reveals an antiquity for itself that carries contemporarily recorded history back to uncomfortably early times. Uncomfortable, that is, for evolutionary and modernistic philosophy. Flinders Petrie highlights some of these points, and we shall consider these and others in this chapter. Among the points he mentions is the account contained both in Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Welsh Chronicles of the attempted invasions of these islands by Julius Caesar in 55 and 54 BC. Caesar, of course, has left us his own account of this, and it is tempting to think, and is often stated, that the Welsh Chronicles, and hence Geoffrey of Monmouth, contain nothing more than a rehashed version of Caesar's account. But close examination reveals a different story. The account of Geoffrey and the Welsh Chronicle turns out to be nothing less than the Julian invasion as seen through the eyes of the early Britons themselves. An eyewitness account, in fact, which dates this part of the material to the middle of the 1st century BC. This, of course, is far too early for most modern scholars to accept for Celtic literacy. Yep. And it also sheds a somewhat unfavorable light upon Julius Caesar, himself the hero of many a modern book on the history of early Britain. But how exactly do the British and Roman accounts compare? Caesar tells us that when he initially landed on the shore of Britain, the landing was resisted in a most alarming way for the Roman troops. The British charioteers and cavalry rode into the very waves to attack the Roman soldiers as they tried to leap from their ships into the sea, and the landing was almost aborted due the unusual nature and ferocity of the attack. Moreover, Caesar had made some very serious miscalculations about the tide and weather that had almost lost him his army. But what does the British account say of all this? Nothing whatever. There is no triumphant trumpeting about the bravery of the Celtic warriors or the Romans' difficulties in making land. Instead, we hear only how, on first receiving news of the Roman landing, the Britons under Caswallon, Caesar's Cassivellaunus, gathered together at a certain fort in Kent. Caesar had clearly been resisted merely by a band of Caesar had clearly been resisted merely by a band of local levies of whom the Britons' intelligence reports had taken no account. But why should they? It was only to be expected by the Britons that the locals would meet the assault, and the opposition to the landing had been unsuccessful in any case. But perhaps the gathering of the Britons at the Kentish fort is one of the more telling aspects of the affair. The Welsh chronicle names the fort Dorel, which Geoffrey of Monmouth transposes into Latin as Dorabellum. It was known to latter Latin writers of Doralevum, and was a fortress that stood roughly midway between Rochester and Canterbury. As Flinders Petrie points out, it would have been the ideal meeting place for an assembling army that was uncertain whether the invading force would proceed directly across the river Medway towards London, or would skirt along the coast towards Sussex and then head north to London, thus saving itself the task of having to cross the Medway. And yet Caesar never mentions this fort for the natural reason that he would have been entirely unaware of its existence and name. A medieval monk rehashing Caesar's work would not have mentioned it either for the same reasons. Of further significance is the fact that Nennius writes in his Historia Brittonum, Julius Caesar, while he was fighting at Dolabella, Dolabella being mistaken in Nennius's source document for the personal name of a British warrior, rather than the fort where the warriors were gathered, and thus revealing that by the end of the 8th century AD, at the very latest, a serious corruption of the account of the British maneuvers from which Nennius drew his own information existed. The fact that no such corruption is evident in the Welsh Chronicle, or Geoffrey's Latin version, speaks volumes not only for the purity of the information contained in both the Welsh Chronicle and Geoffrey, but for the antiquity and undoubted authenticity of their common source material. Later in this account, Caesar describes in detail how his cavalry came to grief when they encountered the unusual fighting tactics of the Britons. He describes these tactics in detail, remarking on their effectiveness, and yet no such description appears in the British account. One could reasonably expect that a later forager or compiler would triumphantly have mentioned how these forebears terrified and almost defeated the Romans with superior and ingenious fighting tactics, but not a contemporary Briton who was recording the same events as Caesar, but from a different vantage point. But again, why should a contemporary Briton mention tactics with which he had his intended readers would have been all too familiar? 3 further specific items of both Welsh Chronicle and Geoffrey's Latin account reveal the sometimes garbled nature of the British intelligence reports of the time that were sent over long distances. In 2 cases from the other side of the channel, and the natural confusion that arose over the debriefing of warriors that returned from the front line of battle and the subsequent interviewing of eyewitnesses. The first concerns the death of a certain Roman officer. He was named as Laberius, Quintus Laberius Durus, in Caesar's account, according to which Laberius died in action during the second campaign in Britain of the year 54 BC. The British account, however, states that Laberius was killed during the first campaign, and more tellingly, it identifies the soldier concerned as Labineus, Welsh Alabines. Now, the name of Labineus would earlier have been known to the Britons from reports reaching them of Caesar's second in command, who at the time of Caesar's second invasion was quite unknown to the native Britons, had been left behind in Gaul to administer matters there in Caesar's absence. Thus, learning from prisoners taken in battle that the dead officer's name was Laberius, they confused the names and naturally assumed that this was the Labineus of whom they had heard. It was a perfectly natural error made in wartime conditions, but not one that would have been made by a medieval forager who had Caesar's account in front of him. Similarly, the second item concerns the garbled British reporter of a fortress that was erected at Caesar's command when he returned to Gaul. Caesar does not name the fort, whereas the British account reports its name to Odina. Flinders Petrie points out that no such place is known, although he does mention that Caesar reports the sending of troops to Lexovi, today's Lisieux, and that the river there, which again Caesar does not name, but which is called Alina, suggests the origins of the British report. Again, the name Odina, which Caesar does not give, could obviously not have been borrowed from Caesar's account by any medieval hand. Let me get a sip of coffee. This is intense. All right. The third incident concerns an inaccurate report by British scouts, which led Caswallon's intelligence gatherers to assume that Caesar had fled Britain at the time when the Roman army was in fact firmly encamped on the shores. Caesar, having lost valuable ships during a storm, ordered that the ships be taken out of the water and dragged inland to within the Roman camp. This was a prodigious feat of engineering. The ships were extremely heavy military transports, and yet the task was well within the, to us, well-known capabilities and engineering skills of the Roman sappers. However, it would not have occurred to the Britons that such a thing would be contemplated, let alone possible, and so it is that when the advanced scouting parties of the Britons could no longer see Caesar's ships beached upon the strand, they naturally but wrongly assumed that he had fled these shores. There are later touching accounts of the early British chronicles, but on which Flinders Petrie is silent, where mention is made of British warriors fighting in this country against the armies of the kings of Syria and Libya, and which look initially like a most unlikely collection of stories. Yet what becomes of these accounts when we view them in the correct historical perspective? The Britons were never ones to employ foreign mercenaries to do their fighting for them. They knew the dangers involved in such a policy, dangers that were unhappily demonstrated when one British king, Vortigern, invited the Saxons over to chase away the Picts, as history records, and to Vortigern's everlasting infamy as far as the Welsh are concerned. The Saxons stayed and eventually banished the Britons themselves to a rocky and inhospitable part of the island, Wales. Rather, in times of war or emergency, the Britons would band together as separate tribes into one fighting force and place their many kings under the authority of one over-king for the duration of the hostilities. Thus, when the Britons encountered the Roman army, they were surprised to find not Romans only amongst the enemy's ranks, if there were any Romans at all, but separate legions made up of Syrians, Libyans, and every other kind of nationality. We know from the archaeological record the Syrians and others did actually make up some of the occupying legions in this country, and it is therefore not only natural that the Britons should refer to them by the names of their countries of origin, but that they should also assume that the Syrians and others were led into battle by their own petty kings, as were the Britons themselves who fought them. It is an unsuspected and striking mark of authenticity that no medieval forager would have thought of. But if this portion of the chronicle contains material that can be dated to the middle of the 1st century BC, then there is other material that goes back much further. One such item, on which again Flinders Petrie is surprisingly silent, is the account of two men named Belinus and Berenius in Geoffrey's Latin version, and Belly and Bron in the Welsh. One part of the story records how Bron led an invasion of Italy and sacked Rome. Certain modernist scholars have been quick to point out that Rome has never been sacked by the Britons, and that the story is a nonsensical fiction. However, a reading of Rome's historians might have led them to a different conclusion, for the sack of Rome by the Celts is told in considerable detail by an early historian of Rome, and the early British account of the event is confirmed and indeed expanded upon in every point. The Roman historian in question is Livy, Titus Livius, 59 BC to 17 AD, whose history of Rome consisted of no less than 142 books, although only 35 of these have survived to the present day. However, it is Book 5 of Livy's history that contains the rather illuminating account that follows. According to Livy, the sack of Rome by the Gallic Celts occurred around the year 390 BC, and we shall see precisely how closely this account with the chronology of events and personages that is contained in the British Chronicle. It matches it exactly, but of more interest to us is the fact that Livy has preserved the names of those who were involved in the planning and carrying out of the attack. The first name is that of King Beturgis, a Gallic Celtic people who were to give their name to the modern city of Bourges. The king was Ambitigatus, and Livy tells us that he had two nephews, one named Belvosius and the other Segoviosus. These two names appear in the British account, where they are given as Beli in the Welsh Chronicle, and Belenius and Saginius, the king of Allobroges, or Brungudinians in Geoffrey of Monmouth. The Welsh Chronicle mentions Saginius as the prince of the Burgundians, and Burgwin, another term for the Allobroges, but does not name him. Each name, however, must have been given in the original British source material for them to appear in either Geoffrey or Welsh Chronicle. And I'm going to stop there because it's halfway through this chapter.